The younger guys thought it was hilarious, an old drunk telling war stories that sounded too crazy to be true. "Sure, Grandpa," one of them laughed. "You single-handedly held off an entire Taliban unit." The bartender rolled his eyes. The regulars smirked. Nobody believed Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison. Until the door opened and his ghost squad walked in, very much alive, very much real. Welcome to Daily Soldier Stories. Before we continue this powerful story of respect, brotherhood, and the truth that some call impossible, tell me in the comments from which city in the world are you watching this video today. And if you believe stories like this need to be heard, hit that subscribe button and help us honor those who served in silence. Murphy's Bar hadn't changed in 30 years. Same cracked leather stools, same neon Budweiser sign that flickered every few seconds, same smell of stale beer and broken dreams that clung to the walls like cigarette smoke. It was the kind of place where construction workers came to forget their aching backs, where divorced men nursed their wounds, and where old soldiers came to remember wars that everyone else wanted to forget. Frank Morrison occupied the corner stool every Thursday night, same as he had for the past 8 years. He wasn't a regular in the traditional sense. He didn't know anyone's name, didn't join in the sports arguments, didn't participate in the easy camaraderie that flowed as freely as the beer. He just sat there, quietly sipping his drinks and staring at a photo he kept folded in his wallet. The photo was old, faded at the edges, showing 6 men in desert camouflage standing in front of a battered Humvee. Their faces were young, confident, unaware of what was coming. Frank was in the center, his arm around a kid who couldn't have been more than 19. Staff Sergeant stripes were visible on his sleeve, but that felt like a lifetime ago. A different man, a different world. Tonight started like any other. Frank ordered as usual, whiskey neat with a beer back, and settled into his corner. The bar was busier than normal, filled with a group of college kids celebrating someone's birthday, and a handful of locals who'd rather drink than go home to empty houses. The volume was higher, the laughter louder, the atmosphere more charged than Frank preferred. He tried to ignore them at first, tried to focus on his drink and the memories that came with it. But the college kids were persistent in their volume, their voices carrying across the bar with the careless confidence of youth. They talked about their futures, their plans, their complaints about professors and exams and problems that seemed monumental in their small world. "I can't believe Professor Martinez expects us to write 10 pages about the Iraq War," one of them complained, a tall kid with perfectly styled hair and a polo shirt that probably cost more than Frank's monthly rent. Like, what's the point? It's not like any of us were there. His friends laughed, agreeing with the sentiment. The Iraq War was ancient history to them, as distant and irrelevant as World War I or the Civil War. Just another chapter in a textbook, another assignment to complete. Frank's grip tightened on his glass. "My dad always talks about how tough his generation was," another kid chimed in, this one wearing a baseball cap backward and a smirk that suggested he found his father's stories amusing rather than meaningful. "Always going on about Vietnam and how we don't understand sacrifice. Dude, we have student loans. That's sacrifice." More laughter. Frank took another sip of his whiskey. "At least your dad actually served," a third voice added. "My grandfather won't shut up about Korea. Goes on and on about some battle where he supposedly saved his whole unit." "Yeah, right. Like one guy could make that much difference." The bartender, a middle-aged man named Pete who'd been serving drinks longer than some of his customers had been alive, glanced over at Frank with a look of apology. Pete knew better than most that some stories weren't exaggerations. He'd seen enough veterans come through his doors to recognize the ones carrying real weight. Frank usually stayed quiet, usually let the comments slide off him like water off a roof. But tonight felt different. Maybe it was the whiskey. Maybe it was the particular combination of arrogance and ignorance in their voices. Or maybe it was the fact that tomorrow marked 15 years since the worst day of his military career. Whatever the reason, Frank found himself turning on his stool to face them. "You'd be surprised what one guy can do," he said, his voice quiet but clear enough to cut through their conversation. The college kids looked over, noticing the old man in the corner for the first time. He wasn't much to look at. Gray hair, weathered face, clothes that had seen better decades. Just another barfly with an opinion and too much time on his hands. "Excuse me," the tall one said, his tone suggesting he wasn't sure he'd heard correctly. Frank took another sip of his drink, considering his words. "You said one guy couldn't make that much difference. I'm saying you'd be surprised." The kid with the backward cap snorted. "Let me guess. You're one of those guys with a story, right? Let me guess. You were a Green Beret or a Navy SEAL or some Special Forces badass who saved the world single-handed." "Army," Frank said simply. 11th Infantry Division, 2nd Battalion, did 3 tours in Iraq, 1 in Afghanistan. The silence that followed was the kind that happens when a conversation takes an unexpected turn. The college kids exchanged glances, not sure if they were dealing with a legitimate veteran or just another drunk with delusions of grandeur. "Okay," the tall one said slowly. "Thank you for your service, I guess, but you don't believe me," Frank finished. "That's fine. Most people don't." "It's not that we don't believe you served," the backward cap kid said, though his tone suggested otherwise. "It's just that guys like you always have these crazy stories, you know? Like, everyone's a hero in their own version." Frank nodded, understanding. "What would you like to know?" The question caught them off guard. They'd expected defensiveness, maybe anger, not this calm invitation to probe deeper. "I don't know," the tall one said. "What's your big story? What's the thing you did that was so impressive?" Frank was quiet for a long moment, staring into his whiskey, as if the amber liquid held answers to questions he'd been asking for 15 years. When he spoke, his voice was softer, more distant. October 15th, 2008, outside Kandahar. Our convoy got hit by an IED, then small arms fire from 3 directions. Classic ambush. Professional work. He paused, taking a sip. 5 vehicles, 23 men. I was the ranking NCO after Lieutenant Henley caught shrapnel in the first 30 seconds. The college kids were listening now, drawn in despite themselves. Pete had stopped wiping glasses. Even some of the other patrons had turned to listen. "The Taliban had us pinned down for 6 hours, Frank continued. "Good positions, plenty of ammunition, reinforcements coming. We were in a bad spot." Another pause. "Lost radio contact after the first hour. Air support couldn't get through because of the weather. It was just us." "So what happened?" one of the kids asked, his skepticism beginning to waver. Frank's expression grew distant. "I made a decision. Took 4 volunteers and flanked their main position while the rest provided covering fire. Took us 3 hours to move maybe 200 meters, but we got behind them." And we ended it?" Frank's voice was matter-of-fact, as if he were describing a grocery shopping trip rather than a life-or-death firefight. "Took out their heavy weapons, scattered the rest. Casualties were manageable." The silence stretched for several seconds before the backward cap kid spoke up. "Come on, man. You expect us to believe you and 4 guys took out an entire Taliban unit?" Frank shrugged. "Believe what you want. It's just," the tall one shook his head. "It sounds like something out of a movie, you know? Like Rambo or something." "Movies get it wrong," Frank said quietly. "Real combat isn't about being a hero. It's about doing what needs to be done when people are counting on you." The college kids exchanged looks again. The story was compelling, told with enough detail and emotional weight to feel authentic, but it also sounded impossibly dramatic. In their experience, real life didn't work that way. Real people didn't make decisions like that, didn't take risks like that, didn't achieve results like that. "Look, we appreciate your service," the tall one said in a tone that suggested he was trying to be diplomatic while remaining skeptical. "But you have to understand how this sounds to us." "Like bullshit," the backward cap kid added, less diplomatically. Frank nodded, not seeming offended. "I understand." But the conversation had attracted more attention. A few of the other patrons had opinions about military stories, about veterans who couldn't let go of the past, about old men who drank too much and talked too big. The mood in the bar began to shift, becoming more charged, more confrontational. "I got an uncle who tells stories like that," said a man in a flannel shirt who'd been nursing the same beer for an hour. "Vietnam. According to him, he won that whole war by himself. Laughter rippled through the group. My dad's the same way, added someone else. Every story gets bigger every year. Pretty soon he's going to claim he took Berlin single-handed. Frank listened to the comments without responding, his expression unchanged. He'd heard it all before. The doubt, the mockery, the assumption that all military stories were exaggerated or fabricated. He couldn't blame them. If he hadn't lived it himself, he might not believe it either. The college kids, emboldened by the support from other patrons and perhaps influenced by the alcohol they'd been consuming, decided to press further. So let's say your story is true, the tall one said, his tone becoming more challenging. You and your 4 guys took out all the bad guys and saved the day. What happened to those 4 guys? Are they still around to back up your story? It was a reasonable question, but it hit Frank like a physical blow. His grip tightened on his glass again, and for the first time that evening, his composed expression faltered slightly. He began, then stopped, took a drink, started again. That's complicated. Complicated how? The backward cap kid pressed. Frank was quiet for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. 3 of them didn't make it home. The admission hung in the air like smoke from an extinguished candle. Even the college kids, caught up in their skepticism and bravado, seemed to sense they'd touched something raw, but instead of backing down, they doubled down. Convenient, the tall one said. The guys who could confirm your story are conveniently dead. It was a cruel thing to say, the kind of thoughtless cruelty that young people sometimes inflict without fully understanding the weight of their words. Frank's face went pale, then flushed with color. Don't, he said quietly. I'm just saying, the kid continued. It's a little suspicious that I said don't. Frank's voice was still quiet, but there was something in it now that made several people look up from their conversations. Pete, the bartender, moved closer. He'd seen this before, the moment when a veteran's careful composure began to crack. Maybe we should all just— No, the college kid interrupted, addressing Frank directly. If you're going to tell stories like that, you should expect people to ask questions. I mean, come on. You sit here every week with these crazy war stories, and when someone calls you on it, you get all defensive. I'm not defensive, Frank said, his voice steady but tight. I just don't appreciate you talking about my men like they were convenient plot devices. Your men? The backward cap kid laughed. Dude, you're sitting alone in a dive bar on a Thursday night. You don't have men. You don't have anybody. It was the wrong thing to say. Frank stood up slowly, his full height revealing that he was taller and broader than he'd appeared sitting hunched over the bar. His movement was controlled, precise, with the kind of economy of motion that comes from years of training. You want to know about my men? He asked, his voice carrying clearly through the suddenly quiet bar. The college kids, sensing they might have pushed too far, tried to de-escalate. Look, man, we didn't mean— the tall one began. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, Frank said, cutting him off. Brooklyn, New York, 24 years old, joined the Army to pay for medical school, wanted to be a pediatrician. His voice was calm, clinical, like he was reading from a file. Took 3 rounds to the chest covering our withdrawal. Died holding his rifle. The bar was completely silent now. Specialist James Jimmy Chen, San Francisco, California, 21 years old. Computer programming degree, enlisted because he thought it would be an adventure. Frank's eyes were fixed on the college kids, but his gaze seemed to look through them. IED got him 2 months later. They never found enough pieces for a proper burial. One of the college kids shifted uncomfortably in his seat. Corporal Marcus Washington, Detroit, Michigan, 19 years old, had a baby daughter he'd never met. Planned to name her Sarah. Frank's voice was getting quieter, more distant. Sniper round, clean shot. He was helping civilians evacuate when it happened. The tall college kid opened his mouth to say something, an apology maybe, or an attempt to change the subject, but Frank wasn't finished. You want to know why I don't have anybody? Frank asked, his voice barely above a whisper now. Because everybody I had died doing their jobs, died following my orders, died trusting me to get them home. The silence that followed was profound, the kind of quiet that feels heavy and meaningful. Pete set down the glass he'd been cleaning. The other patrons stared into their drinks. Even the music from the jukebox seemed muted. Frank reached for his wallet, pulled out a 20, and placed it on the bar. "Keep the change," he told Pete, then turned to leave. That's when the backward cap kid made his final mistake. "Wait," he called out, his voice loud in the quiet bar. "You're just going to walk away after telling us this story about how badass you were? For all we know, you made the whole thing up. For all we know, those guys never existed." Frank stopped walking. His shoulders tensed. When he turned around, there was something in his expression that made several people involuntarily step back. "What did you say?" he asked quietly. The college kid, perhaps realizing he'd crossed a line he shouldn't have crossed, tried to backtrack. How do we know any of this is true?" Frank took a step toward him, then another. "You think I made them up?" he asked. "You think Rodriguez and Chen and Washington are figments of my imagination? I didn't say that. You think I sit here every Thursday night drinking to men who never existed?" The college kid looked around for support, but found none. His friends had gone quiet. The other patrons were watching with expressions that ranged from uncomfortable to actively hostile. Frank was close enough now that the kid had to crane his neck to look up at him. "You want proof?" Frank asked. "You want evidence that my men were real?" Before anyone could answer, the front door of Murphy's bar swung open. The first thing everyone noticed was how they entered, not like typical bar patrons, casual, loud, looking for a good time, but like soldiers, controlled, alert, scanning the room automatically, noting exits and potential threats before focusing on anything else. There were 5 of them, all men, all carrying themselves with the kind of precise bearing that spoke of military training. They were older now, probably in their 40s, but they moved with the fluid coordination of people who'd worked together under pressure. The second thing everyone noticed was their clothes, civilian, but not casual. Clean jeans, button-down shirts, boots that were practical rather than fashionable. They looked like men who'd gotten dressed up for something important. The third thing everyone noticed was how they were looking at Frank. "Holy shit," said the man in front, a Hispanic man with graying temples and smile lines around his eyes. "Frank Morrison. We found you, you son of a bitch." The bar erupted in confused murmurs. Frank stood frozen, his face cycling through shock, disbelief, and something that might have been hope. "Tommy?" he whispered. Staff Sergeant Tommy Rodriguez, very much alive, very much real, crossed the room in quick strides and wrapped Frank in a bear hug that lifted him off the ground. "We've been looking for you for 3 years, Tommy said, his voice thick with emotion. "Ever since we figured out where you'd gone." The other 4 men approached more slowly, their faces showing the same mix of emotions Frank's did. These weren't ghosts or figments of imagination. These were middle-aged men with wedding rings and laugh lines, with jobs and mortgages and all the mundane complications of life after war. "Jimmy?" Frank asked, looking at a lean Asian man with streaks of gray in his black hair. "Hey, Sergeant," Jimmy Chen replied, grinning. "You look like shit." Frank laughed, actually laughed for the first time in years. "Marcus?" "Right here, Sergeant," said a tall black man with a neatly trimmed beard. "Still in one piece, mostly." The college kids watched this reunion with growing amazement. These weren't actors or Confederates. These were real people with real relationships, displaying real emotion. "How?" Frank asked. "I saw you go down, all of you. Rodriguez, you were bleeding out in the dirt. Chen, the explosion." "Medevac got to us in time," Tommy explained. "Barely. You bought us just enough time with that flanking maneuver, drew their fire long enough for the birds to get in." "But the report said—" "The reports were fucked up," Jimmy interrupted. "Typical Army paperwork. Said we were KIA instead of WIA. By the time they corrected it, you'd already rotated out." Frank looked around at his men, his living, breathing men, with an expression of wonder. For 15 years, I thought I'd gotten you killed." "You got us home," Marcus said firmly. "Every one of us." The bar had gone completely silent. Everyone was watching this impossible reunion, this resurrection of dead soldiers who turned out not to be dead after all. "How did you find me?" Frank asked. "Social media mostly," said the 5th man, whom Frank now recognized as Corporal David "Spike" Johnson. Took us years, but we never stopped looking. We've got families now, Tommy added. Kids, mortgages, the whole civilian thing. But we never forgot our sergeant. Never forgot that we owed our lives to you, Jimmy said. Frank shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I was just doing my job. Bullshit, Marcus said firmly. You saved our lives, all of us, and then you disappeared before we could thank you. The college kids, who had been so vocal in their skepticism just minutes earlier, sat in stunned silence. Their carefully constructed doubts were crumbling in real time, replaced by the undeniable evidence of 5 living men who'd materialized like answers to a prayer. Tommy Rodriguez turned to address the bar at large. I don't know what you all were talking about before we got here, he said, his voice carrying the authority of a man used to being listened to. But if anyone was giving my sergeant a hard time, that ends now. He looked directly at the college kids. This man saved my life and the lives of 4 other soldiers in Afghanistan. He did it by making a decision that most people wouldn't have the guts to make, and he executed it with a precision that most people couldn't achieve. He's a hero, and if I hear anyone suggesting otherwise, we're going to have a problem. The college kids looked like they wanted to disappear into the floor. Jimmy Chen stepped forward. Frank Morrison is the reason I got to see my daughter grow up, the reason I was able to walk her down the aisle at her wedding last year, the reason my grandkids have a grandfather. He's the reason I was able to hold my newborn son, Marcus added, the reason I got to coach Little League, attend parent-teacher conferences, be a father instead of a memory. One by one, the other soldiers shared their stories, the lives they'd lived, the families they'd raised, the careers they'd built, all made possible by the actions of one staff sergeant who'd made an impossible decision in an impossible situation. Frank listened with tears in his eyes, overwhelmed by the reality that his men, his boys, were alive and well and had been looking for him. The backward cap college kid, the one who'd been most vocal in his skepticism, slowly stood up from his chair. He began, then stopped, swallowed hard, tried again. I owe you an apology, sir, all of you. I said things I shouldn't have said. Frank looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Apology accepted. The kid sat back down, properly chastened. Pete, the bartender, had been watching this entire scene unfold with the fascination of someone witnessing something truly extraordinary. Now he spoke up. Drinks are on the house, he announced, all night, for all of you. The soldiers cheered, a sound of pure joy that transformed the atmosphere of the entire bar. What followed was unlike anything Murphy's Bar had ever witnessed. The 5 soldiers, reunited with their sergeant after 15 years, settled in for a night of reminiscence, storytelling, and celebration. But these weren't the kind of war stories the college kids had expected. Instead, they talked about the aftermath. Tommy described his journey through medical school, funded by the GI Bill, and his current practice as a pediatrician in Phoenix. Jimmy talked about his successful software company and the apps he'd developed for veterans with PTSD. Marcus shared stories about his work with at-risk youth in Detroit, using his military experience to mentor kids who needed discipline and direction. Each of them had built meaningful lives, raised families, contributed to their communities. But they'd all carried the same burden Frank had, the belief that their sergeant blamed himself for their supposed deaths. We tried to find you through official channels first, Spike explained, but you'd gone completely off-grid after discharge. No forwarding address, no contact information, no social media presence. It was like you'd vanished. I wanted to disappear, Frank admitted. I couldn't face the families, couldn't face anyone. I thought I'd failed you. You gave us back our lives, Tommy said firmly, all of us, and we wanted you to know that those lives were worth saving. As the evening progressed, other patrons began to drift over to their table, not to intrude, but to listen. The college kids, humbled by their earlier behavior, asked respectful questions about military service, about combat, about the transition back to civilian life. The soldiers answered with patience and honesty, sharing insights that couldn't be found in textbooks or movies. They talked about the bonds formed under pressure, about the weight of responsibility, about the difficulty of coming home to a world that couldn't understand what they'd experienced. The thing people don't realize, Jimmy said at one point, is that most combat isn't about heroics. It's about not letting down the guy next to you. It's about doing your job when everything's falling apart. Frank didn't save us because he wanted to be a hero, Marcus added. He saved us because we were his men, and that's what good leaders do. They take care of their people. Frank, who had been largely silent during these conversations, finally spoke up. I need to tell you all something, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the bar. I've spent 15 years drinking to forget you, drinking to forget that day, to forget the decision I made, to forget the weight of command. He paused, looking around at his men. But seeing you here, seeing what you've become, what you've built, I realize I should have been drinking to remember you, to celebrate you. The silence that followed was different from the earlier silences. This wasn't uncomfortable or tense. This was reverent. Tommy raised his beer. To Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison, the best leader we ever served under. To Frank Morrison, the others echoed, raising their own glasses. The toast spread through the bar. Pete raised his glass. The college kids raised theirs. Even some of the other patrons joined in, caught up in the emotion of the moment. Frank, overwhelmed, could only nod his thanks. As the evening wound down, the soldiers exchanged contact information with Frank, making plans for future reunions, for visits, for the continuation of relationships that had been interrupted but never truly broken. We're not losing you again, Tommy said firmly. You're stuck with us now. I have something for you, Marcus said, pulling out his wallet. From it, he extracted a photograph, the same photograph Frank carried, showing 6 young soldiers in desert camouflage. But this one was different. This one had been signed by all 5 of the survivors. We've all been carrying copies of this, Marcus explained, waiting for the day we could give this one to you. Frank took the photograph with trembling hands. The signatures around the border weren't just names, they were messages. Thank you, Sergeant. You saved my life. Never forgotten. Still here because of you. For the second time that evening, Frank Morrison cried. As the soldiers prepared to leave, they had flights to catch, families to return to, lives to resume. Each of them embraced Frank one final time. This isn't goodbye, Tommy said. This is just the beginning. After they left, Frank remained at the bar for a few more minutes, staring at the signed photograph. Pete refilled his whiskey without being asked. Hell of a thing, Pete said quietly. Frank nodded. Hell of a thing. The college kids, who had started the evening so confident in their skepticism, approached Frank's table hesitantly. Mr. Morrison, the tall one said, we wanted to apologize again, properly this time. Frank looked up at them. They were young, well-meaning kids who'd made a mistake, the kind of mistake he might have made at their age. What are your names? He asked. They introduced themselves, Mike, Brandon, Tyler, Sarah, who had been mostly quiet during the earlier confrontation. Well, Mike, Brandon, Tyler, and Sarah, Frank said, let me give you some advice. Never assume someone's story is false just because it sounds incredible. Some of the most unbelievable things that happen in this world are also the most true. Yes, sir, they said in unison. Frank smiled, really smiled, for the first time in years. And call your grandfathers, ask them about their service, listen to their stories, believe them. The college kids nodded solemnly and returned to their table. They didn't stay much longer, leaving quietly without their earlier bravado. Frank finished his drink, left a generous tip for Pete, and walked out into the night air. For the first time in 15 years, he wasn't walking home alone. He was walking home with the knowledge that his men, his boys, were alive and well and had been looking for him. As he reached his car, his phone buzzed with a text message. It was from Tommy Rodriguez. Sergeant, breakfast tomorrow? There's a lot more catching up to do. The team's not complete without you. Frank typed back, 0800 hours, don't be late. Some stories sound too good to be true. Sometimes they sound too dramatic, too convenient, too much like fiction to be believed. But sometimes, if you're very lucky, those impossible stories turn out to be the most real stories of all. Frank Morrison drove home through the quiet streets, no longer haunted by ghosts, no longer carrying the weight of imaginary failures. His men were alive. His men were well. His men had been looking for him. And tomorrow, for the first time in 15 years, Staff Sergeant Frank Morrison would be whole again. That's what brotherhood means. That's what leave no man behind really means. It means you never stop looking, you never stop believing, you never give up on each other, even when the world tells you those stories are too good to be true. Sometimes the most powerful stories don't shout. They wait. They wait for the right moment, the right audience, the right circumstances to reveal their truth. Frank Morrison's story waited 15 years, but it was worth the wait. Now, we ask you, have you ever met someone whose story sounded too incredible to believe? Someone whose experiences seemed too dramatic, too heroic, too impossible for ordinary life? Share their story in the comments. Say their name. Let the world know that sometimes the most unbelievable stories are the ones that need to be told. Because here at Daily Soldier Stories, we believe that every veteran carries stories worth believing, even when, especially when, they sound too good to be true. Thank you for watching. If this story moved you, subscribe to Daily Soldier Stories and help us share more stories of the heroes who walk among us, quietly carrying their history, waiting for someone to listen. And remember, the next time someone tells you a story that sounds impossible, listen anyway. You might be hearing something miraculous.